let me just for a second mention like Pythagoras, for example. This is the guy who invented the theorem we learned about in math class, in school. He actually founded a hugely successful spiritual community in Italy. Like, this is around 600 BC. His followers meditated, they ate no meat, they drank no alcohol, they worked out every day, they practiced music therapy, and they tried to reach enlightenment. I mean, it sounded an awful lot like the years that I spent in ashram. And this was like 2,600 years ago.
Namaste. You're listening to the Sivana podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SivanaSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Sabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Sivana podcast. I am really excited about our show today. Now, I get to read a lot. I'm a voracious reader. And while I enjoy the vast majority of the things that I read, every now and then a book comes along that I really enjoy and I just want to absolutely devour. I recently read such a book. It's called Lost Masters, Rediscovering the Mysticism of the Ancient Greek Philosophers by author Linda Johnsen. And she's coming onto our show today. And not only is she an award-winning author, she holds degrees in Eastern and Western psychology, a master's in Eastern studies. She has postgraduate work in theology and Sanskrit. She's published over 200 articles on topics related to yoga and Hindu spirituality, and she's written 8 books, such as the Daughters of the Goddess, Women's States of India, The Living Goddess, Reclaiming the Tradition of the Mother of the Universe, and as well, this book that I just mentioned, The Lost Masters, that's just recently been released. Really excited to have her on the show today. Linda, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me to talk about my favorite topic.
Well, I have to say, it's before reading your book, it definitely wasn't a favorite topic. The Greeks, to me, for a very long time, I studied them in high school and in college, and they always seemed too caught up just in the rational, too caught up in just the material. I was always drawn more to the mystical side of things, and your book just absolutely brought them to life in a really exciting way for me. So I really appreciate the work that you've done here.
Well, like most other people on the planet, I too thought there was one word to sum up the ancient Greek philosophers: boring. But when I started researching the original Greek sources, I was astonished to find how much the Greeks had in common with yoga students today, with spiritual seekers. Mm-hmm. We're always told that the Greeks were the founders of scientific materialism, But what they tell us about themselves is they were intensely interested in spirituality. Many of them believed in karma and reincarnation, and a lot of them were vegetarian. They meditated. They studied near-death experiences. They fought for animal rights. They tried to understand God and the nature of their own souls. They did have a very rational approach to this, but they did not consider metaphysical subjects to be off limits like a lot of scientists do today.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really fascinating to hear it too, just because I appreciate a certain level of groundedness, and now having read your book, I can see and appreciate the groundedness of the Greeks, but see them also in that light of, but they were really interested in all of these other more unseen or untapped sides of our reality and existence. So I'm excited to dive in with you about this topic. But before we start, tell us a little bit about you and your background.
Raised, ultra-Orthodox Christian. God bless the Christians, God bless Jesus. But wound up kind of going over to the yoga side because I didn't want someone just telling me, be still, know that I am God. I wanted to know how to be still and how to have that experience. And yoga can help people with that. So, I did a master's degree in Eastern studies. I did postgraduate work at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And I used to write I wrote for Yoga International and Yoga Plus and Yoga Journal, and I wrote a bunch of books because it was so much fun to share with people what I was discovering in India and here in the U.S. About spiritual life.
Mm-hmm. And what led you to do the research between the Greek philosophers and Indian sages?
Well, I had written, 7 books about, yoga or about Hinduism, Complete Idiot's Guide to Hinduism and other books. And I didn't want to get to the point where I was repeating myself. So I thought, what else can I look into? And then I was thinking, I don't know. Before the rise of Christianity, what were people in Europe, what were their spiritual practices? And the Greeks were the best documented, so I started reading these sources and then could not believe what I was finding. When I was in college, I took a course on the Greek philosophers, and my Jesuit professor told us to just skip this section and skip that section. And now I was going back and reading the stuff that the scholars don't want us to know, and that's where all the juice was. And incredibly, that's the stuff that was leading me back to India, which I didn't expect at all these links and parallels with India. It was mind-blowing.
And why do you feel it's important to acknowledge this connection between the Greeks and ancient India?
Well, most of us have already heard of like yoga and meditation techniques from India, or Sufism, or the Kabbalah. But what we don't know about is our own Western spiritual heritage. We don't even know that it existed. And then to discover that it's linked with what we yoga students are already practicing and thinking and being taught. It's linked to certain aspects of the New Age tradition, actually, even though with a little bit more grounded emphasis. But and it's also really important to know. We've always been taught that our civilization is based on Western rationalism, and it turns out that no, our Western tradition, is rooted in a mystical tradition that in many respects is almost identical to India's. I couldn't even believe it. And yet there wasn't just 1 or 2 scraps of information. Everywhere I turned, I was finding all these links and similarities.
Well, now, obviously, the mysticism and the beliefs within India are quite varied, and there's a lot of different schools of thought and everything. But who would you say, out of all the Greek philosophers, who is most closely related to, maybe perhaps in a general sense, or you can go very specific, but to the mysticism of India?
Oh, that's a real interesting question, because I could give you like a dozen different answers and they would all be correct. Now, let me explain why that is. In terms, as you know, and more advanced yoga students will know this, there's actually all these different schools and different opinions in the yoga tradition too. So you've got the Samaya tradition, which is where you just meditate and go inside. You've got the Vaisheshika system, where you just do rituals. You've got people who believe, like in the Samkhya yoga tradition, that the soul is something really different from God and different from matter. And then you've got other systems like Vedanta that says, no, it's all one thing. And the thing is that when you read the Greeks, you discover the exact same controversies between the different schools of Greek spiritual practice. So if you want to say, well, Vedanta, everything is one, and everything, if you want to say everything is all an illusion, it's all Maya, then go to Parmenides among the Greeks. If you just want to say, we just merge into the one and it's spectacular, then go to Plotinus. If you want to, if your perspective is no, the soul isn't, it has a divine component in it, but it doesn't merge in God. It always remains its own self, kind of like Ramanuja taught in India. Then you go to Iamblichus. All the same points of view that were represented in different traditions in India, we also find among the Greeks. My personal favorite of the Greeks is Plotinus. I just love him. If I could time travel, I would go back and bow at his feet. He was a great, great, great spiritual master. He actually tried to get to India, but at that time, the Romans were at war with Persia, And so he was traveling with the Persian army trying to reach India, and he was turned back by. He was traveling with the Roman army, and the Persians just stopped him and sent him back. Fortunately for Western civilization, because he went back to Rome and founded a school called Neoplatonism, which, if any of your listeners here are interested, like in Kashmir Shaivism or some of those other very esoteric traditions in India, Plotinus is almost the same thing. It's almost airy.
Well, and what I found interesting too about reading in your book about the histories of a lot of these different thinkers and sages was the interaction between Egypt and Syria and India, where, I mean, it's always bothered me that modern mankind or people today seem to just think of people in the past as a bunch of, ignorant people that had no real connection, that the world was really separated and there was no real interaction of thought. But it seems like more and more now we're realizing like how connected all of these cultures were, which was seemingly denied for so long. I mean, growing up, when I was learning this stuff in school, we didn't talk about how connected these ancient cultures were, but it seems now that it's getting accepted more and more that they really were, not only did they know about each other, but that they were connecting and interacting with one another on a pretty regular basis.
You're 1,000% correct. Pythagoras, Plato, Plotinus, Democritus, Apollonius, some of the greatest names of ancient Greece, they studied in Egypt. Some of them studied in Syria. Some of them studied with the Chaldeans or with the Magi. The guys that we just know because they showed up for Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. But they were the Persian sages. And some of them went all the way to India. Clement of Alexandria tells us that there's a tradition that Pythagoras studied with Hindu Brahmins. Hero, Apollonius, they actually lived and studied in India and then brought those teachings back to Greece and Rome. We just we think it's so awfully far to go between those countries, but merchants were traveling back and forth all the time. And to think that people going on a quest for knowledge would not be as motivated to travel to learn with teachers in other cultures as a merchant would be to go and make a profit. It's a myth that the Greeks were self-educated geniuses who came up with all their ideas by themselves. A lot of them were educated abroad.
Well, and you bring up a very interesting idea in your book. So one of my teachers back from Thailand, he used to say a lot that he had a theory about how India was actually influenced by ancient Egypt. But in your book, you seem to have found evidence that perhaps ancient Egypt was actually influenced by even more ancient India.
The questions about the links between Egypt and India are mind-blowingly fascinating. But I was actually talking about Apollonius of Tyana. In the 1st century AD, surprisingly, the most famous sage or spiritual figure in the whole Roman Empire was not Jesus, who was not really that well known yet. It was Apollonius of Tyana, who was one of the figures who definitely went to India. And when he came back from India, because the two great spiritual cultures known to the Greeks at that time were India and Egypt. So when he came back to the West, he traveled down to Egypt to study with the great masters there. And he was just so staggered by the similarities between the esoteric doctrines and the mythologies of India and Egypt that he thought that in vast antiquity, teachers from India must have come to Egypt to teach the Egyptians. And I mean, similarities like both of them have a creator god who emerges out from a lotus. Both of them have this goddess who goes on a rampage against evil. And in India, she was placated with bowls of blood. And in Egypt, she was placated with jars of beer that had red dye in them, so it's good for blood. And both of those two goddesses were associated with lions. And there are just similarities that it's almost impossible to say are coincidental. And then when you read the Corpus Hermetica, which are kind of the last living remnants the ancient Egyptian esoteric tradition. I mean, it's like you're reading texts from India. I mean, it's karma, reincarnation, respect for the guru, raising your awareness to higher states, then coming back and serving humanity. I mean, it really is like it's not theosophy, but a long time ago, Helena Blavatsky, the Russian mystic, said that there was a secret doctrine that connected all these ancient cultures. And after reading all this stuff, I'm not sure that's wrong. There are just such parallels between the traditions. It's very inspiring, actually.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's definitely something that I experienced reading the book, was that, these names that I was familiar with that, up to that point had been just kind of like I had very little interest in. It seemed very boring to me. As you had mentioned earlier, like now all of a sudden they were coming to life and I'm so much more interested. I literally, one of the things that you have at the end of your book is a list, chapter by chapter, of other follow-up books that you can read about these people. And I've already gone online and ordered some of those books because I'm so excited to find out more about all of these Greek thinkers that were sharing ideas that are very much closely associated with Indian thought, or quite literally were coming from Indian thought directly. As you mentioned, like they went there and they studied with Indian sages and Brahmins, and it's really exciting. In particular, you do a wonderful job of making it really accessible. So your book, although it's talking about perhaps more lofty ideas, it's very readable. Like it's very for people. Sometimes the things that I read are very scholarly and they can be a little rough to get around. And I think what I really appreciated here was that, like, I think anyone could pick this up, read it, and enjoy it, and not feel overwhelmed with technical language and things like that.
Well, yeah, that's my point exactly. There's thousands of books out about the ancient Greek philosophers, but most of them are by scholars for scholars. So I get wild, and I say to my friends, you have to read Plotinus' Aeneid. I mean, this and the Corpus Hermeticum are the two greatest books on spirituality ever published, written in the Western world. And then they read 2 pages and they can't go any further because they can't understand the words. And so I just wanted to write this in terms that people could understand without the extreme technical jargon the scholars use for each other. Mm-hmm. And then I wanted you're absolutely fulfilling my fantasy here, because my fantasy is people will read this and want to know more. So I did list a whole bunch of other beginning level books, some intermediate ones, because they're just so fantastic, where you can go and learn more about all these different, like, amazing sages. Mm-hmm. Let me just for a second mention, like, Pythagoras, for example. This is the guy who invented the theorem we learned about in math class, in school. He actually founded a hugely successful spiritual community in Italy. Like, this is around 600 BC. His followers meditated, they ate no meat, they drank no alcohol, they worked out every day, they practiced music therapy, and they tried to reach enlightenment. It's not an awful lot like the years that I spent in ashram. And this was like 2,600 years ago. But Pythagoras, we just think of him in, number mysticism, or the Pythagorean theorem. But he spent decades studying with spiritual masters in Egypt and Syria and Persia, even with Hindu Brahmins. And get this, his first teacher was Thales, the very same Thales that we learned in grade school was, quote, the father of Western science, unquote. And it was Thales who encouraged him to go to Egypt, because Thales himself had studied with the priests there. It was like, these were really deeply spiritual men.
Well, so we were talking about some of the actual practices of these Greeks, and that they meditated, and many of them were vegetarian and whatnot. Now, you go into this in quite a lot of detail in your book, but we know that the Christians came along and destroyed a lot of the works of these sages, the Romans, but you had Roman emperors and whatnot that were Christian that decided to, for example, like burn the library at Alexandria and destroy temples. They ended up shutting down the ashrams that you had mentioned, or the schools, the academies that you had mentioned. Do you, I mean, with the work that you've done, and obviously you've done tons of research with things, do you think we'll ever find written accounts of the practices that they did, or do you think that they're lost forever?
Two things to say. Number one, I was raised a Christian, and I think Jesus is a mega cool guy. But there are parts of the Christian tradition that really eras in the Christian tradition that really break my heart. When we see some of the religious fanaticism and the consequences of that in the world today, we forget the Christians went through a similar phase in our own tradition. But in terms of finding new texts, I would say the issue is we haven't found what's in the text we already have. Mm-hmm. For example, in the Aeneids, the Aeneids were translated, what was it, back in the 1400s. And so there's this amazing meditation practice in there where Plotinus, the author of the Aeneids, leads his students through 4 stages of concentration, actually the same 4 stages of samadhi that are described in the Yoga Sutras. He has you first focus on a 3-dimensional mandala, which he describes, and then he gradually leads you into the formless state and into what, yogis call nirvikalpa samadhi, the highest state. So we need to just plumb and see what's already there. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's so much that's already there. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, very much has been lost, but it's probably true also that in terms of specific practices, they were considered sacred. They were passed on, guru to disciple. So a lot of that was probably not written down. So that was lost when the gurus were killed or died, and their schools were forcibly closed down. Mm-hmm. I'm just so grateful that even though the traditions in Egypt and Greece and Syria and Turkey, they've all been lost. But the essence of this tradition continues to exist in India. So when we reconnect to the yoga tradition, we are, to some extent at least, participating in what once was the tradition of our own ancestors here in the West, those of us with European ancestors.
Mm-hmm. And where would you say for people that are listening and they're getting excited about this? I mean, obviously your book is a great place to start, but where can people go to start to learn more about the mystical side of the Greek philosophers? So instead of just sitting down and taking auditing a college course on Greek philosophers, where can they start to find out more about the mystical side of things?
Yes, unfortunately, the scholars and the academics are they're embarrassed about this. It's called Oriental contamination of pure Greek rational thought. And so places I can send you, well, I can't even think of any. What we're doing now is we're trying to get this rolling again. And Eckhart Tolle, maybe some of your listeners have heard of. He was the author of The Power of Now, which is a huge international bestseller, deservedly, and A New Earth. He got really excited about this material when he read my book. Mm-hmm. And so he very graciously wrote the introduction to the book. Mm-hmm. And what we're trying to do is really get this more rolling. There are just really a handful of books at a more entry level where people can begin to see what we've lost and how exciting it is, how astounding it is.
Well, I'm confident that when people go and get your book and read it, they'll get excited too. So my question then would be, well, how do we help get it rolling? What can people do to try to get more of this stuff out there and to reveal more of all this great information that is there about this own European tradition?
Well, we need to talk about it and tell our friends about it and get people interested. When there's more people, they can begin to challenge the scholars, who translate from the Greek, etc. And we can just begin really exploring this all together. Now, this is important for a whole variety of reasons, but for example, there are places in America where they're trying to keep yoga out of schools. And one of the excuses is that yoga is not part of the Western tradition. And once we finally really understand what the Western tradition is, then we'll see that it absolutely has a place in our schools. But we're starting virtually from ground zero here. I mean, I wish I could give you, more leads here, but we're starting this right now. And it's exciting and it's fun and it's mind blowing. So we'll see where this leads us.
Well, I hopefully it leads to more and more light. And, again, I mean, hopefully with the part of this podcast and everything else is to help get that information out there to people, because it is exciting and it does allow us a connection to ourselves. To me, I almost feel like it's a bit of a missing link where, right now, we can be caught up in our culture in the West, in the United States, in this materialism and rationality, which is so vital and important in some ways. It leads to, public services and taking care of our health and these sorts of things and critically thinking about things. But the rational mind is still limited in a lot of things in terms of value for us as beings, and being able to swim in the mystic, so to speak, of these other realms that the rational mind simply can't explain is vital to our connection and our experience as beings that's kind of missing from our Western culture. I mean, yoga has moved in to fill that void a little bit and try to offer that to something. But as you said, this gives us a connection, especially for people of European ancestry, to feel connected to something even more directly to their own heritage. And more beautifully, not in an isolationist way, but actually in an expansive way that also connects it to the lineage. It's not saying, well, this is mine and that's yours, but saying, guess what? We're actually connected with this, so let's continue to grow it even to this day.
Well, let me respond to what you were saying just a moment ago. And Pericles was the guy we were told in grade school was the first to teach that matter is made of elements. He was a doctor. But his main interest, according to the ancient sources, was curing souls. Now, he was a hugely popular public speaker, but what did he advise his audiences was critical to their health and well-being. And Pericles told them to meditate. And actually, let me quote him here. This is Empedocles. This is like, 2,500 years ago. He's saying, you must plunge beneath your crowded thoughts and calmly contemplate the higher realities with pure, focused attention. Then a state of tranquility will remain with you throughout your life. But if instead you direct your attention to the trivial things most people obsess about, the silly nonsense that dulls their minds, then all you'll get are physical things that you'll just lose anyway. And I mean, that's what you were just talking about. Let me tell you one more quote by him. This is Empedocles, one of the premier founders of science in Western civilization, describing God. Here's what he says. The divine is not something you can see with your eyes or hold in your hands. It doesn't have a face or feet or gender, but is pure consciousness whose awareness extends throughout the entire cosmos. Divine being is nothing but consciousness in every direction and eternally rejoices in the encircling silence. Now they didn't tell us that when they taught us about Empedocles in school.
Yet, if you pick up any book from a yogi or sayings, I mean, that's that right there. I mean, yeah. I mean, they're talking like the yogis, which obviously now we can say more clearly because they were talking with the yogis. They had contact with them, and there was exchange back and forth, which is so exciting.
Well, and if you've read the book, then you know virtually the first thing that Alexander the Great did when he reached India was send his men out to find some yogis, because Alexander the Great wanted to find a guru. It's and then they brought the Greeks were galvanized by by these teachers in India, and they brought news and information about the yoga tradition back to Greece, and it really, really excited people and made people like Apollonius and Plotinus want to get to India. But anyway, it's all just heady stuff. It's all just, it's like nectar to me, just reading about this and discovering vibrant spiritual life in antiquity at the very root of Western civilization.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love hearing the passion that you have for it, because I mean, when I was reading your book, I was getting just as excited, because every time I'd read, I'd be like, I can't believe that I'm reading something from a Greek philosopher right now, because it sounds like any of the normal yoga books that I would be reading. Like it's really is like that connected too. So it is awesome and exciting. And I hope people do go out and pick up your book. And, hopefully we can continue this dialogue and open things up so that people get interested. And, as you said, the more interested people get, the more translations will come out and the more people will research this stuff and the more revelations will come. So, it's exciting to see where it could go from here. So where can people find out more about you and the work that you do and your books, all of that?
They don't need to find out anything about me. I'm just a regular schmuck like everyone else. But if you want to read my books, Daughters of the Goddess and Women Saints of India describes my research work in India. Here in this country, women can't even become pastors or priests in most traditions, and just traveling with great women like Srimad Kamaki and seeing the enormous respect and veneration people in India have for great women spiritual masters, and that was like just incredible. The Living Goddess, Rediscovering the Tradition of the Mother of the Universe. I actually spent years studying the Shaktadvaita, the goddess tradition, the philosophical side and the spiritual practices associated with the goddess tradition in India. And so I have some just really, I think, great stories about my experiences with some of the masters in the Shakta tradition. And then introduce you to the goddesses. And in the West, the anthropologists, when they talk about goddess religions, it's all just fertility. It's fertility goddess. And that is part of the tradition. But there's also an incredible depth and understanding about what Shakti is, about what the potency of consciousness is. And that's how the goddess is understood in India. I wrote a book. I'm embarrassed to tell you the title because that publisher changed my title to Meditation is Boring, putting life back in your spiritual practice. So that's the title of the book. But that has the most about me and what happened when my husband had cancer and how Shrima helped us and all the amazing experiences like we had with some of my teachers. And people should know, this stuff is magic. And when you connect with that part of yourself, when it comes alive again, when that inner self comes alive again, then it's like your whole paradigm shatters and you're living in a new universe that's like magical and so fulfilling and just an incredible, natural, healthy high, actually. Mm-hmm. And it helps you get some perspective on all the craziness in the world.
Well, and even, just skating a little bit of that craziness right now, I think one of the things that, we're being careful of making sure that we are still celebrating and supporting and fighting for the equality of women in our culture. And I actually, your book, Daughters of the Goddess, is actually arriving tomorrow at my house. I ordered it when I was, after I read Lost Master. So that's coming tomorrow. And maybe perhaps we could have you on the show again to talk about some of these female saints, because again, that's something that we don't hear as much about in our Western culture. Like you said, it's much more prized and appreciated at various times in history, at least throughout India. And I think hearing more of those examples for women, because take yoga, for example, in the United States, where, it's 70-80% women at this point instead of men. And most of the spiritual teachers coming through are men. So it's nice to know that like not only are there female teachers out there, but there's a long lineage and history of female teachers, and that many of these traditions actually encouraged and supported female teachers instead of denying them the ability to teach. So I think that's a really powerful message right now to continue to inspire women to, grow in every possible dimension of growth and in their spiritual lives and everything else. So that's exciting.
Yeah. I wrote that book years ago because it just blew my mind that when people thought of women saints in India, only one figure came to their mind, and that was Mother Teresa. God bless Mother Teresa. But India is filled with great women of spirit. And I just wanted to write a book to introduce people to the native, the native women there and what they believe and how they're regarded. So it was a mind-blowing trip, mind-blowing, and we're still actually very close with some of those women.
Well, I look forward to reading it when it comes. So thank you for so much as well. And I do want to mention as well for our listeners, of course, it will be in the show notes, but www.thousandsuns.com is your website where people can also connect to some of the and see some of the stuff for your books and the things that you've created and whatnot, and connect with you that way.
Yeah, and my husband's stuff too, which has a lot to do with astronomy. So there's a lot of really great. If any of you are interested in Vedic astrology, it's one of the 6 sacred sciences of India. His web program there shows how Hindus see the sky, which is different from how we see the sky here in the West.
And you have a book on that as well, right? On Vedic astrology, is that correct?
Thousand Suns, yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Which is the title of the website. Awesome. Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today, Linda. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed your book, and I encourage our listeners to go out and get it. By the time that this podcast is out, it'll be out. Actually, I think it comes out the day that we're recording it here. So it's coming out soon. It's a really wonderful book, and it opens up a conversation and dialogue that I think is a really welcome conversation to have in the yoga community, in the spiritual community. So thank you so much for taking part in that and creating that work.
Om Tat Sat.
And for all of our listeners out there, I hope you've learned something new. I hope you are inspired to go learn more about this because it really is fascinating. Pick up Linda's book. It's great. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you all have a very present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, if you have a spare minute, please go over to iTunes, leave us a rating and a review. We really appreciate it. And if you're on Facebook, check out our new Facebook group. It's the same name as our blog, Sivana East. Thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Sivana podcast. To find out more about Sivana, go to savanaspirit.com or follow Sivana on Facebook at facebook.com/Sivana Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savanaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Sivana podcast.